Of course, God is amazing as we begin to look at Ecclesiastes, the ninth chapter that we will call Hope Incomplete. And I'm redoing it because I originally called it Hope in Obscurity because this chapter begins with some famous statements about life's obscurity, and it's going to seem to end with some famous statements about life's obscurity. And in the middle, he is going to offer us a little bit of hope for negotiating life, even when we don't understand it, if we go back to a familiar theme of simplicity in appreciating our work or the simple things that we have around us. As he begins in the first few verses, going roughly from verse 1 through verse 6, with this perspective on life's obscurity and maybe even its seeming futility or the vanity that he talks about back in the first few chapters. But here he's going to talk about the way life seems obscure in the way that trying to do right does not seem to pay out. And even when you know it in general, sometimes when you are in the midst of the obscurity of, okay, when does right actually pay out? And when does it just kind of, then that can sometimes take us back to confusing places. As he notices round about verse 2, that the same thing happens to both the righteous and to the wicked, to the good and the evil, the clean and the unclean, to the one who sacrifices and the one who doesn't sacrifice at all, the good as to the sinner, the one who swears as to the one who shuns an oath. And he's going to sum it up in verse 3 by saying, this is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that the same event happens to all, making it seem like there is no benefit or payout in trying to do right. He's not going to leave it alone either. He's going to pick that up again in verse 11, particular verses 11 and 12, where he's going to say, again, I saw in a famous statement that under the sun, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. Understanding that if that's not bad enough, he's going to conclude with an illustration of something that he found perplexing in wisdom, really giving us a bookend to some of the things he said early on about the futility he found in his own wisdom. Here in chapter 9, he seems to give us an illustration of the way in which, once again, wisdom can simply produce disappointment, beginning in verse 13. I have also seen this example of wisdom under the sun, and it seemed great to me. There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that poor man. But I say that wisdom is better than might, though the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. Seeming to give us an indication of the way in which he was listened to insofar as he could save the city, but it's a question as to whether or not his wisdom was valued once the trouble had passed. But even understanding the way in which life does not always make it clear as to whether or not in the first few verses righteousness pays, or as he begins to help us understand once again toward the end of the chapter whether wisdom pays in the middle. He is, again, as we mentioned, giving us some practical simplicity that can help us manage life even when we don't understand it. As he once again talks about in verse 7, beginning, probably going on through verse 10, the way in which we would do well to enjoy our leisure time in verse 7. In verse 8, the way we would do well to take care of ourselves, understanding that our health, among other things, has a lot to do with our quality of life. Going on in verse 9 to talk about the way in which, to the degree that God has blessed us with a spouse, that he would likewise bless us to be able to find joy in our marriage. And going back to a familiar concept beyond simply being able to find joy in your work, he's encouraging us to work hard, because the years in which we will be able to work at all are fleeting. And beyond that, we can try to manufacture joy in all of these areas. But once again, the point of having a relationship with God in the first place is appreciating all of the ways that life is too complicated for us to actually manufacture peace in all of these areas. And part of the benefit of having him willing to help us is allowing him into our lives in a way that will allow him to provide joy in all of these areas, even in the midst of life's obscurity. But the thing that might have most caught my attention related to that poor man who saved the city toward the end of the chapter. One of the things that he is going to notice, in addition to the way in which that old man or poor man might have been dismissed after he was able to help save the city, is the way that he also seems to notice at the very end of the chapter in verse 18, wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. Thus our title, Incomplete, helping us to remember that no matter how much good we do, it's impossible to see all of the ways in which that good can come to nothing because of one thing left incomplete. In this chapter, it is one sinner who remains not so much committed to the good of the city, but to something that can undermine its success. Understanding that the threat is not always external, sometimes it is internal. And he's going to start the next chapter in the first verse, talking about the ways in which, verse 1, dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench. So a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor, talking about the ways in which we can be incomplete in our wisdom, thus self-destructing. And then finally, toward the end of the entire book of Ecclesiastes, he's going to notice the way in which, as the older folks sometimes say, a little bit of knowledge can be a very dangerous thing. As he is going to say, toward the end of chapter 12, round about verse 11, the words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings that are given by one shepherd. Understanding that we can take a verse or two to say just about anything, but Solomon, or the writer of Ecclesiastes, seems to be noticing something that we will hear again in the new covenant, and that is, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Understanding the entire message that he is trying to give us can help save us from the headaches that go along with being incomplete.